Keanu Reeves buys a sandwich at his own diner, stops cold when he hears two cashiers, a Hollywood legend, walks into a small diner wearing faded jeans and 3 days of stubble. Nobody recognizes him. Nobody even glances his way. A Hollywood legend walked into a small diner wearing faded jeans, an old flannel shirt, and 3 days of stubble. No one recognized him, and no one even looked twice. To everyone else, he was just another tired customer stopping in for a quick meal, but that man was Keanu Reeves, and the diner he had just entered was his own. For over a decade, Keanu had quietly owned Thompson's Diner, a place he had built in memory of his late best friend, Charlie Thompson. What started as a struggling roadside joint had grown into a beloved local chain with multiple locations across Los Angeles. It was meant to be more than a business. It was supposed to feel like home, a place where both customers and employees were treated like family. But lately, something had been bothering him. The reviews were still good, customers seemed happy, but behind the scenes, something wasn't right. Employee turnover had increased, profits at the flagship location had dropped without explanation, and no one could give him a clear answer. So Keanu decided to uncover the truth the only way he knew how, by going undercover. He pulled his baseball cap lower over his eyes and stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed softly, but no one greeted him, no smiles, no welcome in, just noise, clattering dishes, rushed footsteps, and impatient voices calling out orders. It wasn't the warm, welcoming place he remembered building. A waitress asked table for one, without even looking up, and Keanu replied, "Counter's fine," roughening his voice slightly. He took a seat at the far end where he could see everything. The lunch rush was in full swing, and on the surface everything looked normal. But something felt off. That's when he noticed the old man at the dish station. Thin, elderly, moving slower than the rest but with careful precision, he worked quietly and steadily while chaos unfolded around him. His name tag read Walt. He looked to be in his 70s, with tired eyes and trembling hands, yet there was something calm and kind about him. When a young cashier finally took Keanu's order, turkey club and coffee, he nodded toward Walt and asked how long he had been there. The cashier rolled her eyes and said, "Forever." Honestly, he should have retired years ago. Keanu said nothing, he just watched. For the next hour, Walt never stopped working. Even when someone dumped a tray of dirty dishes carelessly, splashing water all over him, he didn't complain. He just kept going. But what stood out wasn't his work ethic, it was how people treated him. Customers greeted him warmly, thanked him, smiled at him, and every time he responded with genuine kindness. Then Keanu saw something that made his heart stop. A young mother with 2 children couldn't pay her bill. She stood there embarrassed while employees spoke to her in irritated tones. Without hesitation, Walt stepped forward, pulled out crumpled bills from his pocket, and quietly paid for her meal. The woman left with relief in her eyes, whispering thanks, while Walt returned to work like it was nothing. Third time this week, one employee muttered, and another scoffed, "Old man's gonna go broke saving everyone." They laughed, but Keanu didn't. His grip tightened around his coffee cup. Over the next few hours, he watched even more. Walt stayed past his shift, cleaned areas others ignored, and helped people silently, while younger staff mocked and dismissed him. The manager didn't seem to notice any of it. As the day went on, Keanu realized something important. He hadn't just come to check on his business, he had come to uncover the truth. And the truth was far more troubling than he expected. Because hidden beneath the surface of his successful diner, something was very, very wrong, and he wasn't going to leave until he found out exactly what it was. Keanu Reeves returned to Thompson's Diner the next day during the quieter afternoon hours, wearing the same simple disguise, faded clothes, a worn cap, and an unshaven look, blending in effortlessly as just another ordinary man. This time, he wasn't just casually observing, he was paying close attention to every detail, every conversation, and every interaction that might reveal what was really happening behind the scenes. The moment he stepped inside, he noticed something familiar yet unsettling. Walt was already there, working as always, but his movements were slower than the day before. Every now and then, The old man paused briefly, rubbing his wrist or lower back when he thought no one was watching. The pain was clear, but his determination was stronger. He didn't complain or ask for help, he simply kept going. Keanu took a seat in a booth near the counter, ordering pie and coffee as a cover while he observed. Brandon and Ashley were both on shift again, and almost immediately, something about their behavior felt off. They leaned toward each other, whispering whenever business slowed, their expressions carrying a strange mix of secrecy and amusement. Keanu pretended to read a newspaper, but in reality, he listened carefully. The diner was quiet enough that fragments of their conversation reached him. Brandon mentioned that Walt had been working there for 7 years, mocking him for still doing dishes, while Ashley laughed and called his kindness pathetic. Keanu felt anger rise but stayed still. Then the conversation turned darker. Brandon explained that Walt was becoming a problem because of register shortages, and Ashley quickly realized they could use that. They planned to manipulate the numbers and make it look like Walt was stealing, knowing no one would believe him over them. The reason was simple and selfish. Brandon wanted to replace Walt with his cousin and split a referral bonus. They agreed to execute the plan the next day during inventory, sealing it with a quiet confidence that chilled Keanu. Sitting there, his hands tightening under the table, he realized this wasn't just disrespect, it was a calculated attempt to destroy an innocent man's life. For the rest of the afternoon, he watched Walt more closely than ever. The old man continued helping others without expecting anything in return, comforting a waitress who dropped dishes, fixing equipment after hours, and once again quietly paying for a customer who couldn't afford their meal. Each act of kindness now felt heavier, knowing what was being planned behind his back. When closing time came, Keanu paid and left, but instead of going home, he waited in his car across the street. He needed to know more. When Walt finally came out, long after his shift had ended, Keanu followed him at a distance. The old man's car struggled to start before slowly moving through the city, eventually turning onto a rough dirt road behind the diner. Keanu followed carefully, and what he saw next left him stunned. Hidden among trees stood a small, worn-out trailer, fragile and barely holding together, with rust covering its surface and a tarp stretched over the roof to stop leaks. Walt parked, slowly climbed the unstable steps, and disappeared inside as a dim light flickered on. Sitting in his car, Keanu stared in silence. This was where Walt lived. After everything he had witnessed, the kindness, the generosity, the quiet sacrifices, this was the reality of the man who gave so much to others. A deep sense of guilt settled inside him. How had he not known? How had he allowed someone like Walt to struggle like this under his own business? In that moment, one thing became absolutely clear. He could not remain a silent observer any longer. Tomorrow, everything was going to change. Keanu Reeves woke up the next morning with a heavy mind but a clear sense of purpose. What he had witnessed the previous day refused to leave his thoughts. Walt's quiet struggles, the cruelty of his employees, and the dangerous plan being set in motion all weighed on him. This was no longer just about running a business, it had become personal. He knew he had to act, but not recklessly. If he wanted the truth to come out, he needed patience and strategy. By sunrise, he had already made several important calls and set a plan into motion. He arrived at Thompson's diner earlier than usual, parking at a distance where he could observe without being noticed. One by one, employees began arriving, and as expected, Walt was among the first. His old car struggled into the parking lot, and despite the stiffness in his movements, he stepped out with quiet determination, briefly holding his lower back before heading inside to begin another long day. Watching him, Keanu felt a mix of admiration and guilt. This was the man who had been holding everything together without recognition. Before entering the diner, Keanu stopped at a nearby coffee shop where he met George, the regular customer who had spoken about Walt. Still in disguise? Keanu spoke seriously, asking to understand everything about Walt. George shared his story in detail, how Walt had lost his wife Dorothy to cancer, how he sold everything to pay for her treatment, and how even after her passing, he refused to escape his debts, choosing instead to work with dignity. With no other options, He found a job at the diner and continued living quietly, helping others despite his own struggles. He lived in a worn-out trailer behind the diner because it was all he could afford, and even then, he still gave what little he had to those in need. Keanu listened silently, each word weighing heavily on him. When he returned to the diner, the morning rush had already begun. Taking his usual seat, he focused immediately on Brandon and Ashley, and this time, the truth was impossible to miss. Brandon overcharged customers and pocketed the difference, while Ashley manipulated the register by voiding transactions after customers left. Their actions were subtle but deliberate. They weren't just planning something, they had already been doing it, and now they were preparing to frame Walt. Around mid-morning, a young mother named Samantha entered with her daughter, part of the situation Keanu had arranged. She ordered a small meal, and when it came time to pay, the moment unfolded naturally. She didn't have enough money. Ashley's polite tone vanished, replaced by cold irritation, while the child looked on in confusion. Samantha's embarrassment grew, and just as before, Walt stepped in without hesitation, offering to cover the cost with calm kindness. Keanu watched closely. This was the moment everything would unfold. Brandon observed with a quiet smirk before approaching Karen, the manager, loudly pointing out that the register was short again. Ashley added to the suspicion, subtly directing attention toward Walt. The trap was closing. Karen checked the register, and the numbers didn't match. Her expression shifted from confusion to concern as she walked toward Walt. "Walt, we need to talk," she said, her voice tense. The diner grew quiet as all eyes turned toward them. Walt looked surprised but calm. Karen hesitated before explaining that money was missing and that he had been seen near the register. The words hit deeply. Walt didn't react with anger, only quiet hurt. "You think I'm stealing?" he asked softly. Brandon stepped forward, pretending concern, while Walt tried to explain that he had been putting money in, not taking it. But doubt had already taken root. Karen, visibly conflicted, made the decision she felt forced to make. She apologized quietly and told him he was being let go. Silence filled the diner. Customers watched. Staff stood frozen. And Walt simply nodded, no argument, no resistance, just quiet acceptance. At that exact moment, Keanu stood up, and everything was about to change. At that exact moment, Keanu Reeves stood up from his seat, his chair scraping softly against the floor as every eye in the diner turned toward him. The tension in the room grew heavy, almost suffocating. Walt stood quietly near the dish station, his shoulders slightly lowered but his dignity still intact despite the humiliation he was facing. Karen looked uncertain, Brandon and Ashley struggled to maintain their composure, and the customers watched in silence, sensing that something important was about to unfold. Keanu slowly reached out and removed his worn baseball cap. For a brief moment, no one reacted, then recognition hit. Karen's face turned pale as she stammered. "Mr. Reeves." A wave of whispers spread across the diner, customers leaning forward, some even standing, as realization moved through the room like electricity. But Keanu did not smile. His expression remained calm and controlled, though there was a sharp intensity in his eyes. "Seems like there's a serious situation here," he said firmly. "And I think it's time the truth comes out." Brandon's confidence shattered instantly, Ashley's composure crumbled, and Karen looked overwhelmed. "Sir, we were just following protocol," Karen began, but Keanu cut her off with a quiet yet commanding enough, silencing the entire room. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small device. "You mentioned the cameras weren't working," he said, glancing at Brandon and Ashley. "That's interesting, because I had new ones installed 2 days ago." Karen blinked in confusion, but Keanu calmly replied that it had been intentional. A ripple of shock moved through the diner. Without another word, he walked to the mounted television and connected the device. The screen flickered to life. "Let's see what's really been happening," he said. The footage began with ordinary scenes, customers eating, staff working, but soon the truth emerged. Brandon appeared clearly on screen, taking extra cash and slipping it into his pocket. A gasp echoed through the diner. Then Ashley appeared, voiding transactions and manipulating the register. More whispers followed. Panic spread across their faces. Brandon tried to speak, but his voice failed. The video continued, now showing both of them together, their voices clear as they planned to frame Walt. The room erupted in murmurs. Some customers stood in anger, others stared in disbelief. Keanu paused the video and turned toward them. "A misunderstanding," he asked quietly. Brandon stepped back. Ashley began to cry. But Keanu pressed play again. This time, it showed Walt, quietly helping customers, paying for meals, staying late, working beyond his duty without complaint. The contrast was undeniable, greed and deception on one side, kindness and dignity on the other. Keanu stopped the footage on a final frame of Brandon and Ashley manipulating the register. "This is the truth," he said. Silence followed, heavy and unavoidable. Brandon's arrogance had vanished. "We can explain," he said weakly. "Explain what?" Keanu replied, stepping closer. "Stealing? Lying? Trying to destroy an innocent man?" Ashley sobbed quietly. Keanu turned to Karen and asked if she knew. She shook her head, tears forming, but Keanu replied honestly that not noticing was part of the problem. Then he turned to Walt, who stood overwhelmed, struggling to process everything. Addressing the room, Keanu spoke about Walt's sacrifices, how he sold everything to save his wife, how he still carried her debts, how he lived in a trailer yet continued helping others every day. Gasps filled the diner. Karen covered her mouth. Customers looked at Walt with new respect. Then Keanu turned back to Brandon and Ashley, his voice now cold. "And you chose him as your target?" Brandon couldn't meet his gaze. Ashley broke down completely. At that moment, faint sirens echoed outside. Heads turned. The door opened. 2 police officers stepped inside, and just like that, everything changed. The moment the 2 police officers stepped inside Thompson's diner, the entire atmosphere shifted from shock to finality. The quiet tension that had filled the room was replaced by something heavier: consequences. Every eye turned toward the entrance as the officers walked in with calm authority, already aware of the situation because Keanu Reeves had contacted them earlier and shared the footage. They had been waiting nearby, ready to step in at the right moment. Brandon Cooper and Ashley Simmons, the lead officer, called out firmly. Brandon froze while Ashley's sobbing grew louder. "You're both under arrest for employee theft, conspiracy to commit fraud, and filing false accusations," the officer continued, his words landing like a hammer. Panic replaced Brandon's confidence as he shouted that it wasn't fair and that it was just a mistake, but the officer calmly told him to explain it to the judge. Ashley tried to beg, her voice breaking as she realized the weight of what was happening, but there was no stopping it now. Within seconds, the officers secured handcuffs, Brandon still muttering weak protests while Ashley could barely stand. Around them, staff and customers watched in stunned silence, some shaking their heads, others looking toward Walt with sympathy and respect. As Brandon was led out, he glanced back one last time, but no one responded because everyone knew the truth. Outside, flashing lights reflected faintly through the diner windows as both were placed into patrol cars, the doors shutting with a heavy final sound. Inside, silence returned, deep and overwhelming. Slowly, Keanu turned toward Walt, who stood exactly where he had been, still holding a dish towel, his eyes filled not with anger or bitterness, but with relief, pain, and quiet dignity. "Walt," Keanu said gently, his voice now soft, "I owe you an apology. And more than that, I owe you the truth being seen." Walt shook his head slightly, saying Keanu couldn't have known, but Keanu replied that it didn't make it right. Karen stepped forward, her eyes filled with tears as she apologized, admitting she should have trusted him. Walt simply nodded and said that everyone makes mistakes. No anger, no blame, just understanding. And that hit everyone harder than anything else. Then something unexpected happened. One customer began clapping, then another, and soon the entire diner joined in. People stood, some wiping their eyes, others smiling, the applause steady and meaningful, a shared recognition of the man who had quietly stood among them all along. Walt looked overwhelmed and used to attention after years of working unnoticed. Keanu stepped forward again, addressing everyone, reminding them that the diner had been built on the idea that people and kindness matter, and admitting that somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of that. He glanced at Walt and added that this man never had. The applause grew stronger. Turning back to him, Keanu acknowledged that Walt had been doing far more than his job for years, holding on to the values the place was meant to represent even when no one noticed. Walt looked down humbly, saying he was only doing what felt right, but Keanu replied that this was exactly why it mattered. After a brief pause, Keanu added that this wasn't the end, far from it. Tomorrow, he said with a small, reassuring smile, we're going to make things right. Walt looked at him, unsure how to respond, because for the first time, he didn't know what to say. As the diner slowly returned to motion, everything felt different. Conversations resumed, quieter and more thoughtful. Employees moved with new awareness. Something had changed, not just the situation, but the people themselves. That day didn't just reveal the truth. It reset everything. And for Walt, it was only the beginning of a life he had never expected. The next morning, Thompson's Diner opened like any other day, but nothing about it felt the same. Word had already spread throughout the community, and by the time the doors opened, customers were lined up outside, not just for food, but to witness the story that had touched so many people. Inside, the atmosphere carried a quiet respect, as if everyone understood that something meaningful had taken place there. Employees moved with more awareness and care, conversations were softer and more genuine, and it felt as though the entire place had been reset overnight. Keanu Reeves arrived early, dressed simply without any disguise this time. He walked slowly through the diner, observing the changes. People greeted him, but his focus remained on the people who truly mattered, especially Walt. Right on time, Walt entered the diner just as he always did, but this time something was different. Customers noticed him immediately, some smiling, others nodding, a few even thanking him quietly as he passed. Walt seemed slightly uncomfortable with the attention, yet he responded with the same humility he always had, no pride, no ego, just quiet acknowledgement. Walt, Keanu called gently. The room grew quieter as Walt approached. Keanu asked if they could talk and gestured toward the office in the back. Walt agreed, and once inside, the door closed softly behind them. For a moment, silence filled the space before Keanu finally spoke, admitting that he had spent the entire night thinking about Walt, about the diner, and about everything he should have seen long ago. He acknowledged that Walt had worked there for 7 years, giving more than anyone while asking for nothing in return. Walt tried to downplay it, saying he was only doing his job, but Keanu firmly disagreed. He slid a folder across the desk and asked Walt to look inside. Walt hesitated, then opened it, his hands trembling slightly as he read. Confusion crossed his face as he looked up, unsure of what he was seeing. Keanu leaned forward and explained that effective immediately, Walt was being promoted to floor manager, with a full salary, benefits, reasonable hours, and less physical strain. Walt was stunned, repeating the word manager as if he couldn't believe it. He tried to refuse, saying he had no experience, but Keanu smiled and told him that integrity, compassion, and understanding people mattered far more than experience. As Walt struggled to process it, Keanu slid a second folder across the desk. He gently explained that he had spoken with Walt's daughter, Emily, the night before, and that she now knew everything, the trailer, the struggles, the sacrifices. Walt's expression shifted with emotion, admitting he hadn't wanted her to worry, but Keanu told him she already had been. He shared her words, that love isn't a burden, but a responsibility willingly carried, and Walt's eyes filled with tears. Keanu encouraged him to open the second folder. Inside, Walt found a property deed. He read it again and again, barely able to believe it. Keanu calmly explained that it was a small house nearby, nothing extravagant, but safe and completely his, with no payments or debt. Walt's voice broke as he tried to refuse, saying it was too much, But Keanu replied that it still wasn't enough for everything Walt had done. Tears streamed down Walt's face, yet Keanu had one more thing to reveal. He told him that he had contacted the hospital and paid off all of his late wife's remaining medical bills. Walt froze, unable to process it at first, and then years of struggle and silent sacrifice came crashing down at once. His composure finally broke as he covered his face overwhelmed with emotion. When he managed to ask why, Keanu answered softly that Walt had reminded him what truly mattered, that the diner was never just about business, but about people, and that Walt had never forgotten that. After a few quiet moments, Walt lowered his hands and nodded, not because he had words, but because he understood. When they stepped out of the office together, the entire diner turned toward them. And without needing any explanation, they knew. The room filled with applause once again, but this time it carried something deeper than recognition. It was respect. And for Walt, it marked the beginning of a life he had never imagined possible. In the weeks that followed, Thompson's Diner transformed into something far greater than just a place to eat. What had once been a simple business became a symbol of kindness, integrity, and the power of doing the right thing even when no one is watching. The story spread quickly throughout the city and beyond, drawing people not only for the food but for the experience, the feeling of being part of something real. At the center of it all was Walt. Despite everything that had changed in his life, he remained the same man at heart. He still arrived early every morning, unlocking the doors before anyone else, making sure everything was in order. He greeted customers by name, remembered their favorite meals, and checked on them with genuine care. The only difference now was that he no longer stood quietly in the background. As the new floor manager, he moved through the diner with quiet confidence, guiding the staff, offering support, and leading not through authority but through example. His new home brought him a peace he hadn't felt in years. It was simple, safe, and more than he had ever asked for. In the evenings, he would sit by the window, reflecting on how much his life had changed. On his bedside table rested a framed photograph of Dorothy, smiling during one of their last road trips. It reminded him of love, sacrifice, and the life he once had, but now it brought comfort instead of pain. Beside it lay a handwritten note from Keanu Reeves that read, "The measure of a man is not found in his position or possessions, but in the kindness he shows when he thinks no one is watching." Walt read it often, not with pride, but with reflection, because to him, helping others had never been a choice, it was simply who he was. Back at the diner, the impact of that one day continued to grow. The Walt Thompson Community Fund became a powerful movement, helping families with medical bills, supporting those who had lost jobs, and providing meals for those in need. Customers donated generously, turning one man's quiet kindness into something far greater. The employees changed as well. There was a new sense of accountability and respect. They no longer saw their work as just shifts but as part of something meaningful. Walt made sure of that, treating everyone fairly, listening with patience, and guiding them with understanding. Over time, the culture shifted completely, with new hires trained not only in tasks but in values. Kindness became an expectation, not an option. Keanu also kept his promise, remaining actively involved, visiting regularly, and ensuring that the standards he believed in were truly being lived out. What he had learned from Walt influenced not just this diner, but all his locations, creating an environment where no one would feel unseen or unvalued again. As for Brandon and Ashley, their actions carried consequences far beyond that day, forcing them to face the reality of their choices. But the story was never really about them. It was about Walt, a man who had lost everything yet never lost his kindness, who struggled silently, helped others selflessly, and asked for nothing in return. He proved that true worth is not measured by wealth or status, but by the impact we have on others. One evening, as the diner prepared to close, Walt stood near the counter, watching the last customers leave as the lights dimmed and the noise of the day faded into calm silence. For a moment, he simply took it all in. This place, this life, it was more than he had ever imagined. Keanu walked up beside him and said softly, "Feels different, doesn't it?" Walt nodded. "It does." They stood there in comfortable silence before Keanu added, "You built this." Walt shook his head gently and replied, "No, we did." And that was the truth. Because in the end, Thompson's Diner wasn't built on one man's vision, it was built on the quiet strength of someone who never stopped believing in doing the right thing. And that made all the difference.